Welcome to WCG Talks Trials, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of clinical research, sharing the latest trends, insights, and best practices from experts across the industry. In each episode of WCG Talks Trials, we'll explore a different area of the clinical trial industry, while featuring a diverse range of clinical research and medical professionals. If you're passionate about advancing clinical research, improving patient outcomes, and driving healthcare forward, then WCG Talks Trials is the right podcast for you. We are so glad you could join us today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Yu, Associate Director of Clinical Strategy and Research Solutions at WCG. I'm thrilled to be your host today for today's episode discussing site feasibility challenges impacting the industry and approaches to adopt innovative feasibility and site startup solutions. Before we dive in, let me remind you to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on your favorite listening platforms like Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify, so you never miss an episode of WCG Talks Trials. We're joined today by Trevor Cole, Director of Client Delivery, Site and Strategic Operations for Research Solutions at WCG. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get started, we'd like to ask all our guests, can you tell us about how and why you got involved in clinical research?
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's a true pleasure to be here with you today. I'll start my very first engagement with research. I was doing in-person interviews with family caregivers of ICU patients to understand and assess their burden on multiple aspects of well-being. I can still get goosebumps just thinking about it and how much I enjoyed talking with the caregivers and then being open to share their stressors as well as their triumphs with me. I can really think about the opportunities that I have been given to learn from humanity in a special way, and I'm really overwhelmed with gratitude from the experiences I have from my research career. Clinical research has brought so many moments of joy in my life and allowed me to meet some truly special individuals, from laboratory bench work to site-level study coordination, monitoring oncology trials, to building and leading a research equality and regulatory affairs program, now to collaborating with sponsors, sites, and CROs to drive solutions for everyday challenges while maintaining regulatory compliance. All these experiences have given me so much in return, and I enjoyed the journey. I would sum my journey up as one of hope, celebration, gratitude, and opportunity. Thank you, Michelle.
It's so nice to hear from someone that has so much background and breadth and depth of knowledge in the clinical industry. So thank you for sharing that. Now, let's dive into our topic for today's episode. Trevor, can you provide some background on the challenges that you see in site feasibility and startup today?
Absolutely. I think first, I probably just want to highlight that when I talk around site feasibility today, I'll be discussing it all the way up to site selection. So inclusion of those PSSVs as part of feasibility. So just wanted to highlight that as we're talking today. So currently, we really see industry research site feasibility processes are burdensome to our sites, to our sponsors and CRO staff. And furthermore, the current practices are not standardized within the industry. They're inefficient. We find them duplicative. They cost the industry, which includes sites, sponsors, CROs, and others, millions of dollars. Our site capacity for those redundant, inefficient efforts that may not even truly lead to study participation continue to be a concern in our environment today. Prior to selecting a site for a trial, prospective trial sites are typically required to complete a feasibility assessment, which typically includes a comprehensive feasibility questionnaire and a sponsor or CRO in-person pre-study site visit. Those practices lack really true evidence of value and result in annual cost in the millions of dollars for site sponsors and CROs. We see in an ASCO survey that was done back in 2021, had around 103 site respondents, and they spent a median of 264 hours completing feasibility assessments each year, with all sites spending a combined almost nearly 30,000 hours per year on feasibility activities. So the time and cost spent on those feasibility assessments were really impractical and not sustainable for our sites in the future, particularly in the face of a workforce crisis, as well as having limited research infrastructure. We really need to make sure our studies have agility, as we have that need to expand to more of the community-based research centers where there may be less research dedicated resources And that really highlights an added need to change the current processes that are no longer fit for purpose. We also know the amount of data waste that occurs within feasibility exceeds that of just administrative and cost burden and impacts our digital carbon footprints, not to mention the larger global impacts of, say, a PSSV. We see from the International Civil Aviation Organization that a typical flight from Chicago to LA produces around 867 pounds of CO2 emissions per passenger. So that really equates to 13 to 19 trees just to offset that CO2 contribution. So there, we're just thinking about the sustainability effects on feasibility as well. For sites, we also see that many sites are having to develop SOPs and internal processes and methods to manage feasibility processes currently, but they don't own those processes. And again, they're not standardized. So that can really cause some challenges for sites to perform feasibility activities in a standardized way, which can also affect the outcomes of the feasibility responses that we receive as either sponsors or CROs. Again, some of those feasibility activities, we talked about the crisis and the workforce crisis and the resources, but also those feasibility activities are not typically reimbursed to the site. It's just considered a cost of doing business. So those are some current challenges that I think we see within the industry.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your insight and highlighting the sponsor and the CRO and the site's burdens and times. I think that the CO2 component is not often thought of, but I feel like that's a great area that we can solve. So with that said, do you believe there's any opportunities that are available to improve the site feasibility assessment process?
Absolutely. I think we can start with aligning the industry on simple and standardized feasibility questionnaires with of course, the ability to add study-specific questions that add true value. We just need to consider that. Much like we're going through and we're doing in our risk management processes early on in a study, we're looking at what are the critical to quality factors. It's the same thing here, right? What are those critical feasibility assessment questions that we need to really have? So I think that's kind of a good starting point. Some of the recommendations that actually came from ASCO initially back in 2021 were to implement a short feasibility questionnaire, which again should only include questions that are fundamentally required at the first decision point for the sponsor CRO to decide whether to consider the site further, and as well as the rationale for including those questions they noted should be clear from that perspective. They also noted for some sites, they considered a recommendation around a long feasibility questionnaire, so a little more extended, to capture all the information required for sponsors and CROs to assess site suitability for a trial. And they noted if that long feasibility questionnaire where there's more information gathered was utilized, that a PSSV really should not be required, and that a long feasibility questionnaire also should not be used if the sponsor CRO has worked with the sites within the past 24 months. Regardless of those questions. And they just continued to note that there should be as many members as necessary. I think the recommendation for them came around 10 questions for a feasibility questionnaire. So I think those are some of the opportunities that we have around feasibility, is to minimize the PSSV component, just again, standardize and minimize those questions that we're asking, and also reuse the data that we're gathering these sites so that they're not asked the same questions over and over again if we already know that information.
Mm-hmm. I think those are some really great opportunities. From your experience, are there any new solutions beginning to streamline these feasibility assessments, as well as improving study timelines?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there has been some movement in this space. And what we see is with the establishment of preferred or alliance sites, which isn't totally new, it's been happening for some time, but there is a comfort level to not do PSSVs in those situations when there are CROs or sponsors that have created preferred or alliance sites. We do see that there's that PSSV removal, and also a minimization of the actual questions that are asked because they already have that content to the preferred or alliance sites. Also, what we're seeing is a utilization of internal site networks. So that even more so can drive some of those streamlined activities to bring down reduction of nearly the full feasibility process. Because if it's an internal site network, those organizations, the sponsors, CROs already know the capabilities of those sites. They already have the data around how those sites are performing, what activities they're doing, as well as the evidence of qualification. So those are kind of already provided, so it can really streamline that study startup and feasibility process. What we have also seen is that sponsors and CROs are utilizing, they've done a study in the same indication in the past 12 months with a site, that they're waiving that PSSV. And I think that's, again, where we're seeing some of those opportunities to truly streamline and remove those redundancies within the feasibility process. And even as WCG, right, we're doing stuff in this space as well. We're working to reduce data waste and site responses and collect those site responses in an organic way that really reduce those efforts in the questionnaires. So I think there's a lot happening, and it'll be interesting to see how that continues just as we follow that innovation curve over the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something all of our industry is quite aware of. How do we collect the data once and use it multiple times? So I'm absolutely glad to see that and hear that everyone is kind of aligned with this and working towards that streamline. And I love hearing some of these solutions. So it sounds like there is already some movement forward. Do you feel like there is a willingness to adopt these innovative solutions during our feasibility and startup processes?
Absolutely. We have a lot of engagement, even on LinkedIn. When we presented at DIA this year, there was a lot of excitement around this topic in general. So I think that everyone is also understanding that, yes, this is a burden. We all remember back in 2021, the ASCO findings and that came out, but yet still stuff has not been happening as fast as we'd like them to happen, right? So I think there's a willingness, there's an understanding. And the first phase of that process, right, of any process of innovation is really understanding the problem, knowing the why, having that data. And I think we've had that. We've continued to build upon that data. And we've had attempts, right, within the industry that haven't been as successful as we would like them to be around feasibility. And I think that's, again, being recognized within the industry. And we do see there's attempts at standardized questionnaires and core questions. And it's, again, those things we have to come together as an industry and provide one set of standardized questions instead of having multiple different silos. So I do see that willingness, and I do think it'll follow the typical innovation curve. So we have those early adopters, and then later on we'll have those laggards that begin to buy in at some point once we hit that mid shift. So I think we're still in the early phases of that innovation curve.
Absolutely. And I think there's more action happening in the last few years because we all, I think as an industry, can agree that study startup and feasibility is one of the first steps in conducting a trial and that it could be optimized. So certainly. With that said, what are some barriers that you're seeing in adopting these approaches?
Yeah, so we actually found 4 core barriers that we see when we discuss this at DAA and within the Evoca Quality Consortium here at WCG with some of our members. Really, we can kind of bucket those into four areas. So that first area would be really the regulatory and compliance concerns. So we have some organizations and there is what is their risk appetite, right, for being able to cover those concerns. So some individuals or companies feel a PSSV is another way for them to ensure that compliance. And obviously we don't have, our regulations don't really dictate those activities, right? There are some activities that are required, such as ensuring that they are qualified individuals to do those tasks, ensuring that they're licensed if they are needed to be licensed. So there are some key components there, but that's one of the barriers we see, as well as alignment between our sponsors and our sites and even our CROs. Really, there's just some disconnect around alignment around what is needed versus what are nice to haves or what are some things that we're doing extras. So I think we can have some improvement there to really make sure we're all on the same page. And we've started to do that, right, within the industry. And having this conversation today is starting to get people to think about that and think about how can we align on those activities, because it can be done. And then the next really would be the lack of industry standards or tools, which kind of goes along with that alignment. So like I said, we don't really have a industry standard or tool for feasibility utilizing those core questions. And what's funny is in 2021, ASCO told us they actually looked at those multiple feasibility questionnaires for many sites, and they found that most of those were redundant questions. And so I think that's a key component. We know that they're redundant. So why don't we have this industry standard? And I think that's something that's still lacking. And there is an appetite for people to adopt something like that. And then the final would be really just internal organization prioritization, right? I mean, everybody's fighting for resources, especially currently. And currently it just seems like feasibility renovations just don't make the cut all the time. There's other priorities, right? So I think that's another kind of barrier we see within the industry.
Yeah, I absolutely do agree. All of these are major kind of buckets that we are facing in our industry. There are barriers. I will say, to add to your comment about prioritization and putting maybe not as much resources in startup and feasibility, I think often it's viewed as this is our solution for picking the best sites. And if we have the best sites, therefore it cannot, these are it. These are our only sites. And I think it's important to also consider that while you're running a trial, it is important to check in on your sites, even though they scored, let's say, 100% on your feasibility and site startup. They may not be performing up to your standards and up to what your thought they would do. So certainly something to think about during that steady maintenance phase. But overall, I think that what you have said is quite important. The alignment in our industry between Site Zero and sponsor, and having that industry tool or guideline, if you will, that really can help us standardize and optimize our feasibility process. I know you've mentioned the ASCO 10 core questionnaires. Is there some way that you can point us to where that resource is?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to connect that to the podcast description. So we'll be able to put in a link to the ASCO survey that was released and the data components within that. So our listeners can access that information and dig in. It's very interesting to see that information. So we'll be able to provide that. And Michelle, I want to hit on this again. I love that you mentioned that feasibility is not a finite activity. It is an activity that continues throughout the duration of a clinical trial. And we've seen that with timelines, right? We have to modify timelines. And a piece of that component goes back to that standardization, right? We don't have, when we send out a survey to a site, a feasibility survey, we may have different individuals answering each survey, right? In different areas of the business. Within sites, that's really difficult to standardize because, again, feasibility questionnaires aren't standardized. Some of our networks have started to do that and centralize the responses. But we do see variations in the way sites respond to questionnaires, right? Because they're different individuals answering different questions without a standard approach. So I think it is important to ensure that there's continuity around checking in and ensuring that the study is still feasible. Especially, we have amendments all the time during a clinical trial, right? So an amendment may make something more challenging for a site to address or conduct, or even limit the population a little more than they initially thought. Also, we have patients that come and go from our site. So maybe the estimated individuals we could recruit may modify throughout a trial. So I do think that's an important component of this to consider. And that's another reason to reduce that effort, right? Because it needs to be a continuous activity. And we can't continuously add that burden to our sites on top of conducting the clinical trial and expect them to deliver.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we wrap up, I want to thank you, Trevor, for joining us today and sharing all of your insights on this episode of WCG Talks Trials. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. If you have any questions or like more information about this topic, please feel free to visit wcgclinical.com. We hope you found this episode insightful, and you'll join us for future episodes of WCG Talks Trials. Bye for now.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of WCG Talks Trials. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on your preferred listening platform as we continue to explore different areas of the clinical research industry. As always, we encourage you to join in the conversation. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics you'd like to hear on the show by visiting us at wcgclinical.com/podcast. We're here to serve as a trusted resource as we work to improve lives and accelerate clinical research together.